A voice crackles through the radio, soft, trembling. "Good night. Goodbye. We're going to die." In that final breath, nearly 200 lives vanished, without warning, without mercy. What caused Poland's deadliest aviation disaster? And why did the fire start where no one could see? May 9th, 1987, Warsaw, Poland. It was just after 10 a.m. when flight L.O.T. 5055, a Soviet-built Ilyushin IL-62M, began its departure from Warsaw's Frederick Chopin Airport. The weather was clear, the runway calm, and in the cockpit there was no indication of what was to come. On board were 172 passengers and 11 crew members. Most were Polish citizens. A handful were Americans. All of them, unknowingly, were minutes away from being part of the deadliest air disaster in Poland's history. The aircraft itself, known among engineers as the Mikhail Lermontov, was one of the largest and heaviest passenger jets built by the Soviet Union. Its 4 rear-mounted engines gave it a unique silhouette and a unique set of risks. Unlike its Western counterparts, this aircraft lacked a hydraulic flight control system. Instead, it relied entirely on cables and pulleys. That meant any structural damage, especially to the rear, could immediately compromise the pilot's ability to fly the aircraft. In the left seat sat Captain Zygmunt Polaczek, 59 years old, with more than 19,000 flight hours. To his right, First Officer Leopold Kwiatkowski, 44, and behind them, Flight Engineer Leszek Kolarski. Their mission that day was straightforward: to deliver L.O.T. 5055 across the Atlantic, with a planned stop in New York. The takeoff was uneventful. At 10:18, the aircraft lifted off from runway 33. Engines 1 through 4 responded normally. The climb was smooth. Moments later, Warsaw radar instructed the crew to increase their altitude more rapidly than planned. A military aircraft was operating nearby at 17,000 feet, and they needed separation. The crew acknowledged, advanced the throttles, and began their climb toward flight level 310. 10 minutes into the flight, the cabin was quiet. The seatbelt signs were still on. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, performing final safety checks. Passengers began settling in. Some opened newspapers, others closed their eyes. Then, at 10:37, without warning, engine number 2 exploded. There was no time to react. The fan disc inside the engine had fractured due to a critical failure in the roller bearing. As it disintegrated, high-speed fragments tore through the aircraft's rear fuselage. Control cables were severed. Hydraulic lines, already minimal in this model, were shredded. The electrical system failed. And worse, the explosion ignited Cargo Bay B. What followed was not loud, at least not in the cockpit. But the systems began to die, one by one. Smoke did not rush in. Not yet. But something had changed. The crew could feel it. The aircraft had become unstable. 2 engines had lost power. One was critically damaged. And a fire, still hidden from their view, was beginning to consume the lower fuselage. Captain Polaczek reached for the radio. "Mayday, this is L.O.T. 5055. We have lost engines." Outside, the aircraft continued climbing, but the damage was spreading. And deep inside the airframe, the clock had already started counting down. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. The words from the cockpit were calm, controlled, but underneath there was something else. A rising tension, impossible to ignore. Inside the cabin, most passengers hadn't felt the explosion, but they began to sense the change. The aircraft's steady climb had slowed. There was a strange vibration, subtle at first, like a distant tremor running through the floor. The air grew warmer, and somewhere in the rear a faint smell of smoke began to drift beneath the seats. In the cockpit, Captain Paulachek and his crew were losing systems. The fire had destroyed the main control cables that connected the cockpit to the aircraft's tail. That left them with just one tool, the elevator trim system, a last-resort mechanism never meant to guide the full weight of an aircraft this size. Still, they used it. Slowly, carefully, they adjusted pitch, trying to stabilize the jet. But it was like flying with a frayed thread. The crew knew they couldn't maintain altitude, but descending too fast meant catastrophe. They needed time to dump fuel, to lighten the plane, to find a place to land. But now they were flying blind. Engine number 1 had suffered collateral damage from the explosion. That left only 2 engines, both mounted on the right side, unbalanced, overheating. The electrical system was unstable. Lights flickered. Gauges twitched. For every adjustment they made, the aircraft fought back, wounded and unpredictable. As smoke thickened in the cargo hold, it began to seep through the floor panels at the rear of the cabin. Passengers in the last few rows shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a woman named Helena, reached into her handbag and pulled out a small notebook. With trembling hands, she began to write. May 9th. We are in the air. Something is wrong. There is fire. If we don't survive, let this be found. She closed the notebook, folded it in half, and slipped it under the seat in front of her. In the forward galley, flight attendants were preparing for an emergency descent. Their movements were practiced, steady, but their eyes betrayed what their voices could not. One of them, stationed at the rear, had not returned. Her absence was noted, but no one dared to speak her name out loud. The flight engineers struggled with the fuel dump valves. They were working, barely. Fuel sprayed out of the wings in vapor streams, shimmering against the high-altitude sunlight. But it wasn't enough. The plane was still too heavy to land safely. Air traffic control offered an emergency diversion to a military airfield, Powitz. It was closer than Warsaw. But the crew hesitated. They needed a longer runway, better equipment. They knew Warsaw. They trusted it. After a brief discussion, barely more than a few words, they made their choice. Negative. We're returning to Warsaw. They began the long, slow turn. Outside, the Polish countryside passed beneath them. Fields, forests, villages unaware of what was flying overhead. Inside the aircraft, the temperature continued to rise. Passengers began coughing. Some covered their mouths with jackets or scarves. Parents tried to shield their children's faces. The cabin grew darker. The air thicker. Breathing became harder. Still, the crew fought. In the cockpit, the first fire alarm sounded. The smoke detectors in Cargo Bay 4 had finally triggered. But by then, the fire had already burned through structural supports. It had spread to Cargo Bay 6, then into the lower walls of the passenger cabin. The aircraft was no longer just damaged. It was dying. And yet, it flew. The crew, exhausted, eyes stinging, hands slick with sweat, continued to guide the crippled aircraft toward a city that was beginning to prepare for the worst. As the sun climbed higher over Warsaw, L.O.T. 5055 descended, slowly, unevenly, into a sky filled with smoke. And below, the forest waited, still untouched, still unaware. By the time the outskirts of Warsaw came into view, the aircraft was barely holding together. The cabin, now cloaked in smoke, had turned silent. People no longer spoke. Some sat rigid, eyes wide, clinging to the armrests of their seats. Others prayed under their breath. A few had written farewell notes, folded them tightly, and slipped them into coat pockets, under trays, behind seatbacks, hoping someone somehow would find them. From the cockpit, visibility remained limited. The fire had spread into the rear system's bay. With control cables gone and trim unresponsive, the aircraft no longer reacted as expected. Elevation changes became sluggish, sometimes delayed. It was like steering a ship through fog with a broken rudder, slow, heavy, uncertain. Yet even now, there was order in the cockpit. Captain Pawlacik spoke rarely, but with purpose. His voice was rough, low. The first officer kept his eyes on the altimeter, reading out changes, manually adjusting settings that no longer did what they were meant to do. The engineer monitored fuel and power, counting seconds, watching needles edge toward red zones. They had stopped hoping for a normal landing. What they were doing now, what they had been doing since the explosion, was delaying the inevitable. They were 20 kilometers from Chopin Airport when the first structural failure occurred. The rear bulkhead had weakened under heat and stress. Sections of the tail began to collapse inward, distorting airflow, shifting balance. The cabin lurched. A flight attendant stumbled, catching herself against the galley wall. From the back of the plane came a dull thud, followed by silence. No more alarms, no more status lights. Just the sound of rushing air and the low groan of metal under pressure. Controllers on the ground issued instructions. Turn heading 320. Begin final descent. But inside the aircraft, control was slipping further with every passing second. One final attempt was made to level the descent using remaining power. Just enough to glide past the last village. Just enough to clear the trees. The forest below was still. A dense curtain of pine, tall and quiet, brushed by morning wind. Through a thin break in the smoke, the crew spotted a glimpse of clearing, a moment of hope, gone as quickly as it appeared. At 11:12 and 10 seconds, the tail section gave way. Flames surged forward, breaching into the cabin, consuming the last line of separation between the passengers and the fire. Screams followed, brief, terrified, then lost in the roar. The plane pitched downward, sharp, sudden. The nose dipped and the body followed, no longer gliding but falling. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. For those inside, time paused. One voice, barely audible over the chaos, murmured a last goodbye. And then it ended. The aircraft struck the trees at nearly 500 kilometers per hour. It shattered. Wings torn from fuselage, engines ripped free, fuel tanks ruptured. Fire swallowed everything in its path. In seconds, the silence returned. The same silence that had preceded the takeoff. Now heavier, absolute. What remained was a blackened clearing in the forest, scorched earth, twisted metal, the smell of fuel and pine and burned fabric. Rescue crews arrived minutes later, but there was nothing they could do. No survivors, no cries for help, only smoke, and the weight of what had been lost. The smoke curled upward, a silent column above the trees, long before the first responders reached the edge of the Kabati forest. The fire was still burning, though its fury had quieted. What remained was heat, radiating from the ground, from the twisted remains of aluminum and steel, from seats that no longer belonged to a cabin, but now to the earth. There were no voices, no movement. Just the soft crackle of embers and the rustle of wind through blackened pines. As the rescue crews stepped into the clearing, they did so carefully, not because they feared what they would find, but because they already knew. The aircraft had disintegrated on impact. What had once been L.O.T. 5055 was now debris scattered in a long scorched line through the forest. The fuselage had broken apart. The wings, sheared at the roots, lay hundreds of meters away. The cockpit had been crushed, and among it all, belongings, a child's shoe, a broken pair of glasses, pieces of luggage, some still zipped, others torn open, pages of a diary, damp from the mist, half-burned and unreadable. It was not chaos. It was quiet, a stillness that came not from peace, but from the weight of collective grief. Within hours, a perimeter was secured. Investigators began arriving, their expressions unreadable, trained to focus only on evidence. But even they hesitated at first. There was too much damage, too little left. The black boxes were located on the second day, charred but intact. The data inside them would confirm what many already suspected. Engine number 2 had failed catastrophically. A bearing, weakened by time and stress, had shattered under the pressure of full thrust. The resulting explosion had sent shards of turbine blade into the fuselage, slicing through wiring, igniting cargo. The fire, hidden for nearly 15 minutes, had burned unchecked, melting insulation, severing controls, creeping upward into the passenger deck. The aircraft had not been equipped with fire detection or suppression in the rear cargo bays. It wasn't a violation of regulation, at least not at the time, but it was enough to doom everyone on board. No one had survived long enough to suffer. That was the phrase used in early reports, a phrase meant to comfort, but heavy with helplessness. In the months that followed, as families mourned in silence, as headlines faded, the final report was compiled. It contained timelines, technical failures, human actions. It concluded that the crew had acted with discipline and courage, that the aircraft had been operated within parameters, that the tragedy could not be blamed on one mistake, but on the slow erosion of safety over time. Yet those words did little to fill the void left behind. A monument was raised at the crash site, a granite pillar among the trees. On it, 183 names, each one etched with care. Visitors come still. Some bring flowers. Others simply stand in silence. There is no plaque large enough to explain what happened. Only the forest remains to remember. And perhaps that is enough. A place where stillness is no longer absence, but memory, where the wind carries not only the scent of pine, but the voices of those who tried, until the very end, to bring everyone home. Years passed. The crash site in the Kabati forest softened with time. New grass pushed through the scorched earth. Moss grew over the charred bark. The smell of burning faded. Yet for those who remembered, the silence there was never truly quiet. Families returned, some for anniversaries, others just once. They stood beneath the trees, between fragments of the past and the stillness of the present. Some carried photographs, others brought candles. Most said nothing. Words rarely suffice in places like this, and yet it is memory that holds, that keeps the story from slipping away, the story of a flight, of a crew, of a decision made under pressure, not for survival, but for dignity. In the years following the disaster, Poland's national airline removed all Ilyushin YL-62s from service. The fleet was replaced with newer aircraft, built in the West, equipped with advanced fire suppression systems, triple redundant electrical controls, and modern flight data recorders. Safety procedures were rewritten, maintenance schedules re-examined. Lessons once buried in silence became policies. Policies became protections. But progress came too late for those aboard L.O.T. 5055. The voice recordings from the cockpit, released only to investigators, revealed no panic, no shouting, only calm coordination. In the final minutes, Captain Pawlacik had not pleaded. He had not cried out. He had simply tried, until the very last moment, to keep his aircraft in the sky. It is easy, with time, to let details fade, to reduce a tragedy to numbers, to statistics in a book, to a list of causes. But behind each technical term, structural fatigue, engine disintegration, control failure, there were lives. Passengers who planned for weddings, business trips, reunions, children asleep beside parents, pilots who knew the risks and faced them anyway. And still, amid the loss, there is something enduring. A logbook found near the wreckage, a note slipped under a seat, a voice, nearly lost in static, whispering goodbye. These fragments remind us that aviation is not only about machines or systems. It is about trust. Trust in the crew, in the engineers, in the unspoken bond between those who build aircraft and those who fly them. L.O.T. 5055 never reached its destination, but its story continues, etched not only into stone or into data, but into every safeguard built since. And in that quiet clearing, where the trees once burned, a forest stands once more. Still, listening. Would you like a compiled version of all parts into a single, seamless script?